It's Spencer Hughes with a Hughes from the heart of a different sort here. Some people say I should do a separate podcast altogether for paranormal related stuff, and maybe I will one of these days, but I want to kind of keep it all under one umbrella and welcome our guest here. And I feel like we're longtime friends, even though it's funny, we haven't physically met in the real earthly plane here. We've talked actually, I think for the first time tonight, Kipp. Our guest here on the podcast is a longtime social media friend and now developing to be a real life friend, Kipp Morrill, who is a Bigfoot researcher, among other things. Kipp, thanks for coming on the podcast. This is a treat because 5 minutes ago, you didn't know you were going to be on the podcast. I want people to understand it's 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night, and you're such a trooper that I asked you 5 minutes ago if you would come on with me, and here you are.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That just kind of shows you what kind of life I lead. So obviously I've got plenty of time on a Friday night at 10 o'clock to, on at the drop of a hat. So
here I am in my home studio with AOL dial-up speeds from circa 1995, and somehow we're still connecting. And you are now, are you technically a former Californian, or are you soon to be a former Californian? What do you consider yourself right now?
Well, I guess if officially when I get my driver's license in the state of Washington, but yeah. I would say I'm about probably, let's just say I'm 90% now a Washingtonian, I guess.
Wow. So, well, that's exciting. We got out 2 years ago.
I'm officially gone.
Well, I'm happy to see you gone. I'm sad, really. I have some family and friends still there, but man, it's so much nicer up here. And you spend a lot of time in the Pacific Northwest. You spend a lot of time in the trees and in the woods due to the nature of your occupation and stuff. So you've got to feel more at home here than anywhere, probably.
Yeah, I have a lot of really good friends that I've met through the Bigfoot world, and so Washington is kind of the hot spot, and there's a lot of interesting things going on, and so I'm pretty excited that my career has brought me to Washington. So that's the reason why I left California. It's been an incredible opportunity, and extremely excited to connect with you, and certainly there are actually a lot of other people that I've been friends with on social media in the Bigfoot world that I've never met in person, and now I'm, where I was 10 and 12 hours away, now I'm an hour or 2 hours, and so looking forward to the opportunities when I do have the time. So
now we're not just having you as a guest because you know Bobo. I want you to know that. That's just part of the reason we're having you on. Okay, it's like 5% of the reason.
Right.
Okay, but you actually know Bobo from Finding Bigfoot. A lot of these people that are on these TV shows that go out into the woods and try to, find a Bigfoot.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because these people, before they became famous on television, they were just regular researchers that were out in the woods trying to find evidence and connecting with fellow researchers. And so, it's a kind of an interesting, small, close-knit community. And so having a lot of different friends who worked and were out in the woods with these people before they became famous. And so, through them, and these people are not just on TV and pretending like they're into this phenomena. They're actually really into it. And so, it's an opportunity sometimes to be out with some of my friends who are friends with them and have gotten to know, specifically, been out with Bobo several times. And I have to tell you, he's very much like you would see on TV. He's extremely friendly. He's a great human being and just a lot of fun to be out with, and extremely knowledgeable about the field of Bigfooting and extremely passionate about it. He doesn't just play it on TV. He lives it. So
wow. Now, what was your first? I remember growing up. Now, I always assume I'm older than everybody. I think I'm older than you are, right? I'm almost 50. Do you mind telling us how old you are? Are we almost the same age?
I'm actually a little older than you. I'm actually 52.
How do you pull off looking 20 years younger then? We'll talk about that in another podcast. You have to give us your youth secrets. But I always thought you were like 10 years younger than me. But so we grew up kind of with the same TV shows. I remember That's Incredible. I remember In Search Of. I remember all these mystery shows. You remember all those shows growing up in the 70s and 80s? There were kind of these mysteries, and we didn't have Google. We didn't have the internet. People have to understand that we saw these little glimpses of videos, and they weren't even, it was like reel to reel. It was like newsreel footage of things in the woods that could or could not be a Bigfoot. What was your first fascination with Bigfoot? Does it go back to childhood, or did you not get into it till you were an adult?
No, so absolutely, it was childhood. So I grew up in Redding, California, and so in some ways there was a lot. There was the heart of Bigfooting, in a sense, being in Northern California. And some of my earliest memories was going into the Redding bookstore with my mom, and I probably was 7 or 8 years old, and purchasing some of John Green's books, The Year of the Sasquatch, On the Track of the Sasquatch. I was just incredibly fascinated with the idea that there could be this large bipedal ape-like creature living in the woods. And of course, it scared me to death, but it was exciting and interesting. And so, anytime we made that trip over to Eureka, over to the coast on that 299, it takes you right through Willow Creek. And of course, there's that large wooden statue the carving that was done in the early 70s. And we'd stop, and I actually have a picture of myself next to that statue with my father. And it's funny enough that the gentleman that carved that, he is a entomologist now. At the time when he carved that, he's a very large, very tall man, and he was a Humboldt State student and was very much into the research. He's now an entomologist living in South America.
Is that right?
So, yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Well, I remember my fascination.
Facebook friends with him.
Oh, wow. You got to hook me up with some of these. We got to start a little Facebook chat together like we have here. I love the Patterson video. People who aren't familiar with that, it was the Patterson video that is the most famous known apparent Bigfoot footage in existence, and it's the one that everybody sees on T-shirts, everybody sees on posters. It's spoofed and showcased a million different times in pop culture and in the very fabric of Americana, really, in the Bigfoot phenomenon. I find that very compelling. I don't believe a lot of the newer footage. I think a lot of it is just people in monkey suits and people just horsing around. And in the era of cell phone cameras and easy manipulation, and especially now with, what do they call it? Not VR, but AR, right? Where you could actually superimpose almost anything you want, even off your iPhone. There's apps where you could make a little dragon look like it's in your hand. And if you had shown that to people back in the 70s, they would have been blown away as like, that's categoric proof that there's a dragon sitting in your hands. But you can manipulate anything nowadays. Back then, not so much. And researchers have tried to recreate that. Scientists say it's impossible, that it was a human in a suit, and here's why, and the gait doesn't match up, and they've tried it, and just the way it was moving, and the ripples in the skin and in the hairs. What are your thoughts on the Patterson video that's world famous? Do you think it's authentic?
Well, interesting enough, I actually belong to a group called the Bluff Creek Project, and several years ago, and probably the 2012, 2013 timeframe, they actually went back and, in essence, rediscovered that site where that iconic film took place. And with some of the artifacts that are still there today, of course, the site looks completely different from what it did when the film was shot. But we've actually gone in and been able to, and we're starting to, look at the artifacts that are nearby, and we've been able to pretty much pin down the actual trackway and they refer to her as Patty, which is another compelling and interesting fact, is the fact that in 1967, if you were going to fake a Bigfoot, why on earth would you try and do it with as a female? So, but certainly, it's very compelling evidence. It's some of the best evidence we have. 16 millimeter film. The famous iconic frame 352, where you see her look and kind of tilt back. It's a very iconic part of the film. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's some of the best we've got. It was before things could be truly manipulated, and there were times and certainly films that were tried to manipulate. But certainly it's very compelling, and I truly believe I actually have had the opportunity to meet and talk with Bob Gimlin.
Yeah, who was filming it?
So Roger was the one that filmed it.
Right.
Yep, and when Patterson fell off the horse, he said to Bob, as he's filming, "Cover me." And so, not knowing what the creature would or would not do, so Bob drew down as the creature made its way across the sandbar as Roger shot that iconic film. So So there were two people there that day, and Bob Gimlin was one of them.
That's just fascinating. And I'm kicking myself, Kipp, because I remember now, it's coming back to me. You invited me on that trip. I remember the Facebook message where you reached out to me. Do you remember that? And you said, we're going back to where they did the Patterson video. Can you come? And I have to dig up my Facebook messages and see what my excuse was, because I'm kicking myself now for not having gone. I hope it was a really good excuse.
I think it was because I think you Bigfoot people are crazy, but...
Oh, no. I wouldn't have said that. I might have been scared to go in the woods. Now, when that Bigfoot looked over, right, the famous frame where it looks over, was it looking at them? Like, was this thing aware that it was being watched by these two people, or was it far enough away? Was it just kind of looking around anyway to make sure there weren't any predators around or something? What was it? Do they know what it was doing? Did it look at them? Was it making eye contact towards them, or was it just looking in their direction?
So I believe the way I understood it was she was down by the water and was kind of over near a root ball. And, of course, the horses came up, and the theory is that the sound of the horses was masked by the sound of the creek. And you got to remember, in 1967, this is after that I think there was a large flood that occurred. Was it the 65 flood that just was huge flooding back in 65? I think it's 65 in the Pacific or on the coastal range over there. And so she was behind this root ball. And so I think that she was startled, they were startled, she stood up, and that's when Roger's horse bucked him off because the horse was frightened. And so she was very much aware that they were there. And so when she looks back, she's making her way towards the, that place on the sandbar, and she's looking back at them, kind of just keeping an eye on them. Later on, when they came back and covered some of the tracks and actually did some casting, they did some hiking around the hills, and they found a spot where they found a footprint up on kind of the hillside, and they believed that that she was possibly sitting up there on the hillside watching them cast the tracks, possibly. So there's that theory. We don't know that for sure, but it's very interesting to think that maybe, and really, I mean, how many times have I been in the woods hiking? So part of the Bluff Creek project is we have these trail cameras set up in and around Bluff Creek and in and around that film site. And so we've kind of, it's open knowledge, and there's a lot of people that are very interested at going in and down to the film site. And so we have footage of, I'm just throwing out it's an arbitrary number, but it was like 1:00 in the afternoon, and this couple went walking by the camera, going towards the film site, this one particular camera, and that was at 1:00. And at 1:10, there walks a mountain lion walking the opposite direction with the same camera. Wow. And so, it's how many times have you been in the woods and
not seen
walked and been, and it's been right there to, whether something is behind a tree or behind a rock or, is aware of you, but it doesn't make itself known. Yeah. I think it happens all the time. So it makes it very possible that she was up on that hillside watching them cast her tracks.
Wow. So. What's fascinating to me is that footage. I remember seeing it as a kid. It kind of startled me because it looks honestly like a female gorilla almost with some human qualities. But honestly, Kipp, just what the hell is this thing? I mean, what do they think? Do they think it's the missing link? Do they think it's just, can it be some kind of a forest gorilla that we don't know of in North America that shouldn't be living there? Or in other words, I don't know why people make it out to be some otherworldly thing. Like, it's so preposterous to think there could be a primate in the woods of North America and Europe. I mean, they're all over the place. I mean, Asia has sightings of Yeti and things like that. But what do they think it is? I mean, it's not a monster. I mean, do they think it's like half man, half ape, or is it all ape that shouldn't be living in there but is, and they're repopulating themselves? What's the main theory that you kind of adhere to? What do you think it is?
I fall back to we don't know what we don't know. And honestly, until we have a biological specimen, it's going to be hard to tell. I tend to think that it is some sort of, I don't want to say missing link, but it's interesting because obviously this creature, whatever it is extremely shy, it's curious, stays to itself. has the ability to survive in some very harsh environments, but hasn't mastered or doesn't know how to light fire. So, it doesn't have any of those abilities that that an agrarian society or something might have. So it's really hard to tell. But I think that it's I fall back to this when people say, well, that's not real because we would know about it by now. But isn't that the arrogance of the human race to always think that we always know everything, that we've figured everything out, when constantly we're finding new species, we're constantly finding, whether it's the ocean or something else. But kind of beating around the question, haven't I? A little bit.
No,
but,
that's okay. I mean, it is interesting. I just find these things believable to me. Like when people say it's so preposterous, just like the Loch Ness monster. Maybe that's the misnomer, Loch Ness monster. If you think to yourself that there could be a species of like sturgeon, like giant sturgeon or something that could be in Loch Ness, it doesn't become so absurd, does it? I mean, why couldn't it be that? I mean, they're a very primitive. I mean, that what is it called? Is it called river monsters? That show that had the where people fish those big ugly fish out of the rivers that are actually in there, and they look like they're prehistoric. They look like they should have been extinct, 1,000 years ago. I forget what it's called, river monsters, or
I think you're right, river monsters or something.
Yeah, I mean, those are real fish. I mean, why can't the Loch Ness monster just be a huge, unexplainable species that? All you need is a couple of them in there to have a few babies every once in a while, and it's big enough that they could be lurking in there. There's speculation Lake Tahoe has, I forget what it's called in Lake Tahoe. It escapes me the name, but there's a legend that there's a sea monster there too. And I just don't see why, of all the weird things, I mean, just the fact that we're here talking to each other right now, the mathematics, the odds of you having been born, the odds of your parents getting together at the exact moment they did, and you being conceived at the exact split second that you were. It's inconceivable that I exist and that you exist. And yet somehow we think that Bigfoot's preposterous. I mean, we're preposterous. I mean, the fact that we're spinning through space on this big blue marble and everything just works. I mean, that should open up the imagination to anything, right? The fact that we have a heartbeat and we're communicating and we're hundreds of miles away from each other and doing a podcast here. I mean, this is all impossible stuff.
Miracles exist. I mean, it's true. And it's interesting. And, a different kind of look at this whole phenomenon is the Native American aspect. And a friend of mine, Kathy Strain, she has a book. She is a Forest Service anthropologist, archaeologist, and she has a beautiful book that she's done, and it talks about the different legends of the hairy man, all the way from the coastal Alaska all the way down through British Columbia, down into California, Washington, Oregon, and California. And what you'll find is, even though these tribes have been, separated and not necessarily connected, but many, if not all of them, have a hairy man story, Skookum or Sasquatch or something like that, a hairy man in the woods. And it's very interesting. I remember I had a conversation with a person from the Hoopa tribe, and I said, "Do you believe in Sasquatch?" And he said, "Oh, the hairy man." He goes, "Oh yeah." He said, "The hairy man lives up there. We just don't go up there. Or if they do, if they're collecting mushrooms and they come upon one, they take the basket." And they set the basket down and they walk away. Yeah, it's very interesting, that the Native American connection. And when you were talking about the river monsters, there's all these different Native American tales. It was very interesting because some of those were meant to help try and keep their children safe. This tale about the river monster, for instance, there was some sort of sea serpent that it was either the Hoopa or it was the Yurok or the Kuruk. Talk about this sea monster. Well, if you think about it, you have young children, you have small children, and you don't want them to drown. So what's a great way to try and keep them away from the river?
Oh, yes.
There's a river monster down there. So, or, the hairy man's there. And so there were different interesting kind of ways that certain Native American it's theorized that some of these different tales came about to try and keep their children safe. So yeah, kind of
That's
interesting.
Really interesting. Yeah. Whenever I tell people I'm into this stuff, and it's sort of like we lived in a very different subject, obviously different phenomenon. We lived in a very haunted home in in Lincoln, California, our former home before we moved here. And I was a healthy skeptic until that house. And from the day we moved in, activity started. And it was a brand new house. We were the only owners. And at the time, all 6 kids were living at home. They were young. All but the oldest son saw the same things at different times, independent of each other. We didn't share anything with the kids. We didn't want to freak them out. They would come to us and say, we saw this shadow figure dart across the kitchen floor, and we had been seeing it. We're like, oh my God, this is real. It's real. So it's one of those things where you can't convince people. I for a while there, Kipp, I was obsessed with trying to make people believe what I saw, and I don't really care anymore. I don't want to prove it to anybody else. I'm just curious for my own sake. Is that how kind of you are, where you believe what you believe and just you believe what you believe, and other people can believe otherwise? But the minute I stopped trying to prove it to other people, I just was able to relax and just say, this is really a cool phenomenon. I don't know why it's happening. I don't have any answers to it. I don't know if they're really ghosts or interdimensional beings, or is that kind of how you are, where you just, what you know, you're curious, you want to maybe see one of these things, maybe up close and personal, but it doesn't matter if the other guy doesn't believe you. Even if you come face to face with one and it's true, it doesn't really matter, does it?
No, it doesn't. And you're absolutely right. There are, I think, a fair amount of people that I know that are involved in the phenomenon who didn't get involved only for any other reason other than they had an experience. And they want to be able to prove it to themselves. And I think that some of them started out trying to want to show, I am not crazy. I know what I saw.
Right.
People, the first thing that people always say is, oh, well, and they're very quick. I'm sure you experienced this with your phenomenon in your home. Oh, well, you just saw this, or
yep.
you just saw a shadow, or you saw a bear. And so there's always those people that weren't there, that weren't experiencing it, that try to tell you what you saw. And so I think there's a fair amount of people that I know of that didn't get into it, weren't looking for it, but had an experience and want to validate that experience for themselves. And so for me, I've met enough people. I have some family and some very close friends that have had some very personal experiences that have been, both frightening and shocking, and so for me, I would be what you would call a believer, and some of these people are knowers, and I enjoy. It's a hobby for me. It's exciting. I think that having a mystery is extremely interesting, and so I don't let it bother me anymore. In my line of work, I've actually, because of it, I've actually had some connections with people that have had some experiences, which is good, and I've been made fun of, and that's okay. I don't mind. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I'm a 52-year-old man. I can think for myself, and it doesn't bother me.
Yeah, and one thing I find with like our haunting is that people disbelieve sometimes out of fear. And what it means. And I've noticed, and I grew up Catholic. I'm not a Catholic anymore, and I haven't been for many years, but I grew up in the Catholic religion. And for some reason, and I hope this doesn't offend people, doesn't offend you or anybody else listening, Catholics are ingrained for some reason to believe that somehow ghosts can't be real, or that the Bible somehow, they interpret the Bible as saying that, anything that's a ghost that you think is a ghost is really a demon. And we could go around the barn on that one. I don't want to get into that whole phenomenon, but I've noticed that a lot of my religious friends who are deeply religious are scared to death to hear about a haunting. They think, because, they grew up that it has to be a lost soul, or souls go to heaven. So why the heck would Grandpa be haunting, the house? He should be in heaven with Jesus, and he ought to be up here, and he's down here instead walking the hallways of an old hotel. It doesn't make sense to them. And I think a lot of people feel threatened as to what it would mean if ghosts were real. And that's why, Kipp, after seeing this whole COVID crap with all the shortages of toilet paper and all this nonsense, this is exactly why the government will never come clean about UFOs. I think they do know something. They may know something about Bigfoot too, but they're watching us, and they're like, these people are freaking nuts. If we give them the lowdown on UFOs, these people it's gonna be mass suicides. People are gonna be on the highways driving to nowhere, and we're gonna have mass anarchy and chaos. And that's what I think. I think the government knows a lot more than it's letting on, but it watches us, and it goes, God, these people with a virus with a 0.5% death rate are ready to fly to Mars. I mean, can you imagine if people knew the truth about Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, or if the government knew the truth about UFOs, you think they would tell us?
I have an interesting theory. I work for the federal government. And so,
you're a man in black.
Proud,
I mean, we know that now.
Exactly. I've been put on this earth to seed disinformation. No, but I work for a federal land management agency. I've been a wildland firefighter for over 30 years, and I've been asked many times, well, what do you think? Do you think that the government's hiding this thing about Bigfoot? And I said, the federal government, and again, I'm a very proud federal employee. I work very hard. I take a lot of pride in what I do, and but the federal government can't get out of its own way sometimes, and so. I'm constantly telling people, something incredibly just doesn't make sense happens. And I said, these are the people you want to run your healthcare? Really? Yeah. Is this what you want? And so my theory is that I think it would be difficult, from what I believe and from what I know, to hide something like that. Is it possible that maybe there's something going on more than what I'm aware of? Or absolutely. But yeah, I think it's hard for me, having been a federal employee and working for a land management agency or several land management agencies over the years, to think that there's some sort of conspiracy to hide this. But again, it very well could be, but it's hard for me to comprehend.
Well, it's typical you would say that. It's typical.
Yeah.
I knew you would say that. Like, my cousin's an airline pilot, and he goes, oh, come on. There's no chemtrails. Do you think, I'm a pilot. I would know. I'm just kidding you, Kipp. But he does say that. I'm like,
Right.
If you were spraying people with chemicals, you're not going to, admit it. So anyway.
Well, it's interesting. I actually, living in Orland, California, just outside of Chico, it was a very starry night, no moon, and my wife and I were sitting in our hot tub. And I'm looking towards the north, and what caught my attention was there was something that was blotting out the light from the stars. So I could tell that something was moving through the sky from north to south, and it kept getting closer, and I kind of blinked my eyes because I was trying to figure out, am I really seeing this? And so my wife, who's sitting with her back to the north, I said, take a look. Am I seeing something? And she turned around and she looked. She says, yeah, I see it. I see it as well. And it's continuing to move north to south, and it literally starts to come right over the top of us. There was a street light on the other side of our house that was on, and whatever this was, it was triangular shaped.
Wow.
There was no lights, and as it passed from north to south, it was just low enough that the light from the street light illuminated the bottom of the craft just enough so that you could tell where it was. Completely silent, no lights, triangular.
Wow.
Do I believe that it's a UFO? Yes, it was unidentified.
Right.
But my theory is that it's ours. It's something that the SR-71 was something that was secret forever and a day.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's probably one of ours. But I know what I saw. She was right there. She saw it.
Wow.
There will be those that say, oh, well, you didn't really see that. Well, you know what? You weren't there.
Yeah, no, exactly.
But it was an incredible experience, and and it was, I saw it. So,
well, let me ask you this. Here's something that all the skeptics bring up, going back to Bigfoot, and I have to admit I don't have an answer to it. And when I say they're just clever and they evade us pretty well, I feel kind of silly saying that. I'm almost like I feel like I'm coming up with a screen story, and it's not a good one. Why is it? It's interesting that the most concrete footage that we think is real, the Patterson video movie from the late 60s, when there were no cell phones, now everyone has a computer in their pocket. Everyone has high definition cameras in their pocket. We're all at a moment's notice taking selfies next to bison. We're jumping off of cliffs, with parachutes. We got cell phones to chronicle every birthday, anniversary, every divorce, every funeral. We can capture every moment of existence on a cell phone, and yet we don't have thousands, we don't have hundreds, we don't even have dozens of really, really compelling cell phone footage of Bigfoot. What is going on here? There's a lot of people that spend a lot of time in the woods, not just Bigfoot researchers, like the kind of thing that I'm going to be going on tomorrow night. I'm very excited. Just hikers, swimmers, backpackers, horseback riders. They've all got their cell phones. They're all filming themselves doing their activities. They're on kayaks. They're on horseback. They're everywhere. Motorcycles, everything. Why the lack of footage? Why the lack of anything but hoaxes so far, or footage that sets research back 20 years? Because every time some idiot puts on a monkey suit and gets caught, it makes all the valid researchers look like idiots. It makes everybody look like hoaxers. Why is there no, I mean, why don't we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of compelling pieces of evidence by now?
Well, I guess my question would be to answer your question with a question, which is, how do we not know that there isn't? And my answer for that is, social media has been both a blessing and a curse to not only Bigfoot research or UFO research or paranormal, because it gives everybody basically a platform to try and put something out there. I guess, pardon the expression, but it's hard to wade through the crap to find actually something that's real. And so I believe that there's probably more compelling evidence that is out there. My friend Bart Catino, who I hope you'll meet soon, his Sierra footage, it's very compelling. We went back and did some reenactment of the footage that he did with his thermal camera, and that exists. And Bart will be the first person to tell you that it's not damning evidence, but it's compelling evidence. I was there when we went back to try and do the recreation, and Robert Leiterman, at the time he was a state parks ranger, had investigative skills, and we showed up as a big team to basically go and take a look at this footage that Bart had taken with his thermal camera. And as Bart walked up to Robert and said, "I want you to destroy my evidence. Do everything you can do. Basically, I want you to thoroughly vet everything that we've done, everything we did that night, every bit of evidence where people sat, the filming location, whatever you need to do. I want you to debunk this if you can." And we spent the better part of a week out there in the Sierras, measuring, waiting for nightfall, experimenting with, there was a rock throw. We think that there was a rock throw, but the rock had heat. So how would a rock have heat? Well, one of the theories is that, they are rock throwers, and they use rocks for weapons. And so, but where do they carry rocks? Because they don't have pockets. Well, you know what? It's very possible that maybe they tuck a rock under their armpit. It's a great place to carry it. It's possible. And that, guess what happens when you have a rock under your arm? Probably gets warm. And so, we did experiments with that. And so, I think that there's probably more out there, but unfortunately it's just masked by so much of the nonsense. And there is a lot of nonsense. And so people get caught up in that. So I think it's quite possible that there could be some more compelling evidence out there. But like you said, with all of the technology and all of the ability that they have to hoax and do all these different things, until we have a physical specimen, I think that we truly may never have the answer.
Yeah, and I always, I don't hold my breath, but every few years, it seems like once every few years, there's somebody that says they have a carcass of one, and it turns out to be fake. You remember the one that they put in the cooler and stuff, and they showed it on TV, and it looked like it could be a Sasquatch corpse, but it turned out to be nothing, like a dead animal or something. And I think one of these days maybe we'll get to the truth of this, Kipp. I don't know. It just seems interesting to me that, like you said, the whole hairy man thing and going back to ancient cultures, and a lot of countries have these legends, and they came out long before YouTube. They came out long before social media. They came out long before comic books. I mean, when people say, oh, well, UFOs became popular, with the sci-fi, movies and things like that, but people had been seeing UFOs for thousands of years. I mean, it wasn't just because of Roswell that everybody invented UFOs. I mean, people were seeing things in the sky they couldn't explain for a very long time.
I have two questions that I ask myself. The first question I have is, do I really want the mystery to be solved? And I can't answer that question to myself, because I think that there's something about having the mystery and having it be a mystery that's extremely compelling. And I guess the other thing is, and I've talked to what you would call knowers, people that have had experiences, and I ask myself, do I really want to have an experience? I think I do, but some of the people that I've talked to, my cousin had an experience, and I'll tell you that story another time, but she's the same age as me. She's 52. She works in the medical field. She's extremely intelligent. She has no reason to lie. But when she talks about it, it's a very personal thing to her. And she says, and she's very teary-eyed. She'll say, my life changed that day when I realized that monsters were real. And so, yeah, I asked myself, I don't know. I think that I'd like to have an experience. I think that I'd like to have a sighting. I think that I'd like to, but it can be very, very frightening, and it's life changing for some people. There's some people that have hunted their whole life and been outdoors people their whole life, and having an experience that's frightened them to the point where they don't want to go in the woods, or if they go in the woods, they never go alone, they never go unarmed. So pretty interesting.
Well, it's interesting. I had, he's deceased now, sadly, but my godfather, my uncle by marriage and my godfather, his brother, is the only person I know directly that had, family member and stuff that had a Bigfoot experience. And he was in the woods of Sonoma County. They had a lot of redwoods and a lot of forest out there, obviously. And, he didn't write a book. He didn't make a movie. He wasn't profiting from this. He didn't give lectures and charge people admission. He just shared this with a very few people. But I remember being younger and hearing that story, and it put hair on the back of my neck, where it was a beautiful story and frightening at the same time, where he said he saw this thing that was clearly, he knew instantly what it was. It was a Bigfoot, and he knew it wasn't a bear. He got closer to it, and it just kind of looked at him, and he said, and he had a weapon with him, I think, or something, and he said the last thing on earth he thought of doing was to pull out that weapon and do any harm to this thing. That it just, he said it was overwhelming, the sense of humanity that he got from this thing, that it didn't come across as an animal. It came across as more human than animal. And that just gave me shivers, where they were kind of looking at each other, and then it kind of just went on its own way. And he said it was just this utmost respect he felt for it, almost like a love for it. It's hard to explain, but just like this love for this thing, where like, he wouldn't want to put it in a cage. He wouldn't want to like bring it back on his back and, try to put it in a museum somewhere. It was just kind of doing its own thing, and he just respected it. And he said he was changed after that forever, that, he never really spent a lot of time thinking of Bigfoot. He wasn't, some crazy guy who made up stories or was hoping to see one someday. He just ended up seeing one. And he said just the level of humanity behind it, it never occurred to him that it was going to hurt him or that he should bring harm to the creature. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
And there are those encounters which are a lot like that, like you just explained, which are life-changing, but there's a sense of that there's no harm to be done. But then there's the opposite ones, and those can be, and there are those out there that could be quite frightening. There was an account probably a few years ago, and this was on another Bigfoot podcast, but retired firefighter from the Bay Area had a piece of property up in the Sierras, and this thing, whatever it was, screamed at him and screamed and screamed, and it's just the most frightening account that you could imagine. And, a lot of some of these encounters, and, luckily there, it seems like there's, it displays of fright, to frighten away somebody or move somebody away, or, certainly, maybe they've, and I think that people walk away from those experiences understanding that this thing is big enough and powerful enough that had it wanted to bring harm to them, it would have, and they wouldn't be coming out of the woods. But for whatever reason, they did. And so those are the frightening accounts. There was a story that was up here in Oregon, where a gentleman with his children, he parked his truck up on a log landing and was hiking down a skid trail down towards this creek, river, to go fishing. And his children were walking along, and this thing, 8 feet tall, hairy, right there, stepped right out in front on the trail. And he, first impulse was to put his children behind him, And then what did he do? He took his fly fishing rod and stuck it out between he and this creature, and the creature walked up and put its chest right to the end of this fly fishing rod and started to walk forward. And so what did he do? Backed up with his children, and literally this thing backed him up all the way back to his vehicle up on the landing.
Wow.
He got in and got his children, and they left. And the theory was maybe there was young. Maybe this whatever this was clearly did not want them to be there. And it wasn't threatening or menacing other than the fact that it was making it very clear that it did not want them to be in that area. And you'll hear a lot of those different stories. People where they're escorted, and I'm using my finger quotes, out of the woods because they don't want them there. There's something going on there. And so, yeah, there's some very interesting stories like that.
Well, we could talk again sometime. Will you come on with me again? I know this was last minute, and you came on with like 5 seconds notice, so I really appreciate it. And I didn't mean to keep you for 45 minutes, but I think we could do this again sometime. We're just scratching the surface, and we could talk about some of your own personal expeditions you've gone on and searches and your own experiences. I'd love to talk more.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm thrilled and excited to come on. And obviously we've been talking for almost an hour, and I could talk about it for probably another hour or 2 hours. It's something I'm very interested in and so very passionate about. So appreciate you inviting me to come on and talk about it.
Oh, absolutely. Kipp Morrill is our guest here, and he's a super cool guy. And I feel like, seriously, there's few people I feel that way about that I've never met. Like, I feel like we're old friends, and we've never actually physically met. And today we actually talked, I believe, for the first time. And
I think so.
And it's great, my friend, after all these years. And I'm sorry we didn't get sushi back in Northern California, but now that you're in Washington, let's get some sushi, especially when things start opening up more.
I like it. That sounds great. I'll look forward to it.
Kipp Morrill, my guest here on Hughes from the Heart, a very special edition. If you'd like to support the podcast, please do so at patreon.com/Spencer Hughes. And if you'd like to support the podcast with a one-time donation, those are greatly appreciated. And those can be made at paypal.me/Radiospencer. Much gratitude and more interviews like this to come. They'll always be free, so please share them with everyone you know. My goal is to gain exposure with Hughes from the Heart to spread kindness and joy, levity and good cheer to as many people and to touch as many hearts as I humanly can. Thanks for helping me do that.